his long-term experiment. First of all, a couple of bits of housekeeping. Please can I ask you to keep your microphones muted throughout, and we generally ask people to keep their cameras turned off just to save on bandwidth. You're very welcome, and in fact we would encourage you to pop your questions in the chat as we go through. You'll find chat's little speech bubble in the right hand corner. If you click on that, that will open up a chat window. Please do pop your questions and comments in there for at the end of the seminar. We'll be chairing a question and answer session after Steve has finished talking. So without further ado, I will hand over to Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carly, for that introduction. Thank you also to Ben Sykes and to the Ecological Continuity Trust, not only for inviting me to speak to you today, but also for involving our Llyn Brianne stream observatory work in the general mission of the Ecological Continuity Trust. And it is, I think, an honour for us to be involved with such an important organisation, drawing together these different elements of long-term work across the United Kingdom. What I want to do is give you a perspective of some work, both monitoring and experimental work, that has been going on in central Wales and more broadly across Wales since the early part of the 1980s. Tell you something about the theoretical background, some of the key results that have emerged, and just say a little bit at the end about how the work that we've done has had broader impact. So that's the kind of direction of travel. So essentially, anyone who is a stream ecologist, a river ecologist, knows that the catchment perspective is one of absolutely fundamental importance in the work that we do. And the basic notion is that the attributes of river catchments, be they continental or maritime, be they island or continental, be they temperate or polar, have a major influence downstream on the attributes of the rivers that drain those catchments, be it the kind of geological character, the flow character, the discharge pattern, the soil type, the general climax, vegetation or agricultural use. And these are really fundamental principles that were identified in the 1960s and 70s by people like Llyn Likens and Noel Hines, who were really major seminal thinkers in ecology, and in particular freshwater ecology, as I started my career in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And it was people like Llyn Likens, here's Llyn Likens at the Hubbardbrook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire, who demonstrated that not only could experiments be carried out at whole catchment or whole subcatchment scales, but in manipulating things like woodland cover in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, Llyn demonstrated that there were very major signals that occurred downstream as a consequence of things like forest removal. So forest removal in these instances led to big pulses of nitrate and nitrogen that were exported downstream as soon as the major utilization of nitrogen in the catchment was arrested. So here's this kind of seminal principle, not only of catchment scale influences, but also of catchment scale investigations and experiments. Now that same principle applies not only to fundamental influences on stream ecosystem function and structure, but it also applies to anthropogenic influences on catchment characteristics. And here's a photograph that I took flying over the middle hills of Nepal in the 1990s. And what you can see at the scale of this photograph is where, for example, terraced agriculture or general removal of climax vegetation has led to very extensive patterns of erosion. We know also there were changes in chemistry in these instances, that had downstream effects that permeated right the way through the whole Ganges basin. So the principle of fundamental effects carrying through to anthropogenic modifications that had downstream signals. Well, how we kind of capture and conceive of this in a monitoring or an experimental context is really quite a challenge, because the scale of the processes we're dealing with in whole catchments is much bigger than the typical plot scale at which many experiments in ecology actually take place. If you imagine these are cartoons of whole river basins, we might choose at certain points to kind of take samples that allow us to carry out contrast between areas that have different land use, or we might try and manipulate land use or some of the feature at subcatchment scales to give us points at which we could then monitor or assess the effects of those contrasts or manipulations. At certain points in this hierarchy, we could also choose to make biological measurements. We might also measure processes within river basins to try and support what might be some kind of correlative or weak inference assessment of pattern. But this kind of combination of comparisons, manipulation, process studies give us a way of understanding how river catchments work. And of course, we can also follow the trajectories of change through time, and ideally for as long a time as possible, to capture the processes that are going on at these very large spatial and temporal extents. Well, that contextual background essentially reflects the way that the Llyn Brianne project came into being. In the late 1960s, the Llyn Brianne Dam was closed to act as a regulating reservoir for the River Toy that actually supplies drinking water to Swansea. But at the same time as the reservoir was closed in 1969, there were concerns about the loss of spawning habitat to the very major run of sea trout for which the Toy in those days was famous. There is still a run of sea trout. It's not as big as it was in those days, but there were various schemes put in place to try and ensure that these wonderful sea trout could still access their upper catchment spawning environments. But through various pieces of evidence, the production of smolts, the production of fry was never as big as anticipated when the dam was closed. That led to an investigation by what was then the Scientific Directorate of Welsh Water in the days pre-privatisation in the 1960s and 70s. And essentially that work illustrated that there was a major problem with acidification and acid deposition upstream of Llyn Brianne Reservoir. So these are areas sensitive to acid deposition. They had very substantial amounts of conifer in their catchments, as well as receiving acid deposition. And essentially the evidence that emerged was that in these acid sensitive areas, streams draining conifer had increased acidity, increased metal concentrations, but also the conifers, by intercepting airborne mist droplets and water droplets, increased sulfur and nitrogen deposition by about 50 to 80%. So in other words, there was a process that had been investigated that could explain why these streams draining conifer, in particular in these base pore areas, were more acid than others. So it was that the Llyn Brianne project came into being, and we designed it from 1981 onwards to have contrasting river catchments draining different land uses: acid moorland, circumneutral moorland, acid forest, deciduous woodland. And quite important in all of this were the design parameters. So on the one hand, the catchments had to be big enough for second to third order streams so that there was a measurable biological response that we could see. At the same time, they had to be small enough for us to manipulate something of the scale of 15 to 250 hectares. They had this range of land uses. They were on a gradient of acid, kind of acid to circumneutral conditions. they were typical of upland Wales, and also quite important in this case, they sat against a backdrop where regional assessments were made in parallel to the work that went on at Llyn Brianne, what was called the Welsh Acid Water Survey. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we actually go through the talk. So Brianne essentially has, depending on how you count them, 14 to 16 different catchments. They're spread across these land use types. Some of the catchments have never been manipulated purposefully in all of the kind of 40 years of the project. There is this acid-base gradient that gives rise in the southeastern corner to streams that are circumneutral and therefore richest in species. In the northern corner, the streams are more base poor. And then there are different blocks within this array that either have moorland or deciduous woodland or conifer forestry on them. And then very importantly, the Welsh Acid Water Survey sites surround Llyn Brianne, sampled in 1984, 1995, 2012. And again, in those different time periods, something between 50 and 100 of those sites have been sampled continuously through the entire run of the time over which the Llyn Brianne project has been carried out. All of this initially was set up by, first of all, Welsh Water Science Directorate, then the National Rivers Authority. Cardiff University got involved in the very early 1980s, and the project came increasingly under our control from the 1990s onwards. Now, also important, as well as the fact that there are reference catchments that have never been manipulated, various manipulations have gone on in the catchment. So in 1987 and 8, we added calcium carbonate to the catchments of 3 of these different streams, spread either by helicopter or by tractor. Densities sometimes typical of agricultural lime applications, sometimes bigger. And then also essentially throughout the whole time scale of the project, there have been typical rotational forest management activities going on. Actually looking at these forest management activities is going to be one of our next departures in the way we look at the long-term data. But just now to give you some kind of indication of the kinds of results that have emerged through time, very extensive monitoring has been set up at different time periods in the catchments. What we're looking at here are some data for essentially paired catchments within the suite from the 1980s, in this case through to 2006, looking at the consequences of calcium carbonate additions, either on calcium concentrations or on pH. And these pairs in each case are looking either at a limed forest catchment relative to a reference, a limed moorland catchment relative to a reference, or down at the bottom, pH in those same paired conifer forest catchments. And what you see is there is very clearly a measurable effect on stream calcium concentrations and pH as a consequence of the manipulations we were carrying out. In some cases that persisted really for quite long time periods. Now, my bigger interest in all of the work at Llyn Brianne has been around the responses of stream organisms, either to long-term change or to manipulation. And I've worked dominantly with a range of organisms, everything from algae through invertebrates right up to river birds. But the bulk of the long-term work at Brianne has been on invertebrates. And there's really interesting kind of sets of questions that we've come to address as time has gone on, which is around the relationship between the richness, the community composition of invertebrates and land use and stream water quality pattern linked initially to acidification. So what we're looking at here are Welsh Acid Water Survey data with the diversity, the richness, either mayflies, caddis, or stream organisms in relation to aluminium, which we knew was influenced by conifer forestry. And the expectation at Llyn Brianne is that as time has gone on, as acid deposition has abated, then we should be seeing evidence of recovery, increasing richness, changes in the community composition of invertebrates as streams have recovered from acidification. Now, there's kind of, again, different elements in which Llyn Brianne and the regional survey data have worked in tandem to help us understand this particular set of problems. The work at Llyn Brianne has told us roughly how many taxa, how many species, what kinds of species we should see under different land use conditions. The Welsh Acid Water Survey data has given us indications of their species tolerance. And with these kind of background data, we've been enabled to calibrate models that help us to predict the kinds of changes we should see if recovery from acidification from the effects of acid rain was occurring. And those two requirements are quite simple. On the one hand, we should see an increase in pH, but we should also see a gain in species typical of circumneutral conditions. My wife incidentally drew this figure of different ellipses to represent the different richnesses of the streams at Llyn Brianne, and I have no idea how she did the geometry, but it works incredibly well. So again, looking at the long-term trends, what have we actually seen relative to those requirements for recovery? These are long-term data in mean pH, both from Llyn Brianne in the kind of continuous bars, and in red from the Welsh Acid Water Survey sites for acid forest, acid moorland and circumneutral reference streams. And you see pretty much in expectation from recovery from acid deposition that there has been a progressive increase in pH in our different streams at Llyn Brianne and indeed across the region. There are some punctuations in this, so interesting rainfall events in around 2013 caused a bit of a reversal. Nevertheless, the pattern here is very much one towards chemical recovery from acidification. That is shown even more clearly where we look at the minimum pH, in other words, extreme conditions that occur at high flow. And again, you can see that the minima we've recorded have generally increased, in fact, in all stream types at Llyn Brianne as time has gone on. Now, there's a major question, however, about the extent to which that change in chemistry has been matched by biological trend and recovery. And this figure essentially uses an ordination method to look at how invertebrate assemblages at the three major stream types at Llyn Brianne have changed through time from the early 1980s, in this case up until 2018, for circumneutral streams, for acid moorland and acid forest streams. And again, we've superimposed the Welsh Regional Survey data over the top of the patterns from Llyn Brianne. And what you see is that, in fact, there has been some biological change, but insufficient biological change for the most acid streams to converge in invertebrate community terms on the circumneutral reference stream. So the inference is that something appears to be holding back recovery if on the assumption that the circumneutral streams act as a reference for which those acid streams should be converging. And now, in fact, I think the lack of really clear biological result is one of the most exciting things that could have ever happened at Llyn Brianne. Patterns amongst organisms did not match expectations from liming. It hasn't matched perfectly expectations from recovery and acid deposition. And we have a range of hypotheses that we've been able to investigate and poke around with to understand why that recovery has been incomplete. Is it that the habitat is inappropriate, that there is competitive exclusion? Maybe there are limits on dispersal and recolonization. Maybe acid episodes have continued and they cause these reset events. Perhaps climatic effects have become important, or maybe there's some stressor that we're overlooking. So really, you know, the fact that things didn't go to plan at Llyn Brianne was just a really major opportunity for more ecological investigation. And we've picked apart these different hypotheses for limited recovery. Our favoured hypothesis at this stage is one involving continued acid episodes. And what this figure illustrates, these are the group data come from the thresholds we know, where if you plot pH minima against maximum aluminium concentrations, we can see the different conditions under which different kinds of species should occur at Llyn Brianne. But in actual fact, the trends we then see through time in individual year points against those different trajectories illustrate that it's only now in the most recent few years that conditions, episodic conditions, have reached those where we could expect recolonization by acid-sensitive organisms. And in fact, these patterns are matched by the fact that we now have some mayfly species recolonizing only our acid moorland streams, but not yet our acid forest streams. Of course, they've always occurred in our circumneutral streams. Just a little mention here of some of the other hypotheses we've investigated. So dispersal patterns was another potential reason, the potential failure of acid-sensitive organisms to reach the streams at Llyn Brianne, but by carrying out malaise trapping for invertebrates near to the banks of the streams and across catchments, we know that we've been able to detect acid-sensitive organisms that we've never found in 40 years of sampling in individual streams that can only have arisen in the locations we've caught them by movements across watersheds. So in other words, we can discount dispersal as a possible reason for recolonization failure. Now, I want to come on and talk a little bit about some of the climatic work that has come into focus as time has gone on at Llyn Brianne, because we think that climate is another major potential stressor which has effects at Llyn Brianne. And our first paper in climate change actually was written in Llyn Brianne in 1991, where we looked at drought effects. But we really got seriously interested in the early 1990s as we looked at what the ramifications of the North Atlantic Oscillation appeared to be in our Llyn Brianne stream. So here's this long-term index based on work carried out by Jim Hurrell in the United States that looks at pressure patterns in the North Atlantic. And we're able to separate over Western Europe, Western Britain in general, positive NAO winters bringing us warm, wet, stormy weather. And this is because of the way that air masses circle around different pressure systems in the Atlantic system. And by contrast, negative indices give us cold, dry conditions. And what you see in the kind of late 1980s, early 90s is this very big positive amplification in the NAO, which actually brought us warm, wet conditions. One of my PhD students, David Bradley, was taking measurements of invertebrates over this same time period. So here's the big positive amplification of the NAO. And what he detected looking at invertebrates was that climatic effect was matched by a very substantial reduction in the interannual stability, the similarity of invertebrate assemblages at Llyn Brianne. So these warm, wet, stormy conditions were matched by or associated with a very substantial change in invertebrate community pattern in our Western British kind of upland Llyn Brianne streams. An Atlantic weather system appeared to be driving at some kind of conditions that affected organisms in the Llyn Brianne streams. Well, we've picked apart this effect further. So here are some data we published in 2007 in Global Change Biology, looking at how the North Atlantic Oscillation actually had a very substantial effect on winter temperature in our streams at Llyn Brianne. So something like a 3 degrees centigrade difference between negative and positive NAO years at the top, plotted out as a kind of time series, at the bottom as a regression. And interestingly enough, Malcolm Elliott published almost an identical regression relationship from the black browse beck in Cumbria, illustrating that this relationship could very well be a wider geographical pattern. Well, again, as time has gone on, both as a consequence of NAO effect, but also as a consequence of warming at Llyn Brianne. So again, these are data which we published in 2007 in Global Change Biology, illustrating that the abundance of invertebrates in Llyn Brianne not only was declining through time as our streams warmed up, but abundance pattern appeared to be related to temperature conditions. And in fact, the initial assessments we made in the 2000s was that the average abundance of organisms in our richest streams at Llyn Brianne fell by about 20% for every 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature. And this was very much the initial pattern, but it's one that appears to have continued through time. So these are data from another of my current PhD students working with Ian Vaughan and myself, Fiona Joyce, who's become interested in resilience against climate change effects, but she's illustrated with longer term data that in fact invertebrate abundance decline has continued in all of our Llyn Brianne streams. Some other work we've just kind of added to that by another ex-PhD student, Stefano Larsen, who again worked with us in the early 2000s. Stefano, now working in Italy, is still working with the Llyn Brianne data. And what he's illustrated in some work that he's doing at the moment is that that reduction in abundance depends on the temperature preferences of the different organisms that occupy the streams at Llyn Brianne, and it's the cool adapted species that are declining the most rapidly. Their abundances have gone down by about 40% since the 1980s. So again, this is a kind of pattern consistent with climate change effects. We don't think thermal tolerance is the whole story. It appears to be part of it. But again, this is quite a horrendously complicated figure, but this is from another of our PhD students, Marion Pye, who looked for her PhD at the residence time of organic matter in the different streams at Llyn Brianne, the quantities in relation to land use and the export of particulate organic matter under different flow conditions. And what you essentially see is that her work, first of all, occurred during typical long-term weather conditions at Llyn Brianne, but there were some instances of very high rainfall. The export of material, the storage of material was very strongly linked to discharge pattern, and the storage of organic matter, either particulate fine matter or particulate coarse matter, very strongly depended on catchment land use. And in broadleaf streams draining broadleaf woodland, the inputs of litter to our streams were sufficient to offset downstream exports that increase in warmer, more stormy conditions. Now, organic matter is a really major source of energy for stream communities, for stream organisms. And the kind of inference from all of this is that that key resource persists for shorter time scales in the streams at Llyn Brianne whenever we have warmer, wetter conditions, very typical of those that we're progressively moving into as climate change bites. Now, we've taken this idea and applied it in other locations. This is some work carried out by Steve Thomas, in this case, exporting the idea of catchment scale investigations into the Brecon Beacons and illustrating, if you look at the numbers here, these are invertebrate biomass estimates, which are greater under deciduous woodland or with deciduous buffers than in other kinds of land use type. And again, the inference from this is that appropriate deciduous woodland management in the riparian zones of upland streams could be used as a means not only of adapting stream environments to temperature fluctuations, but also as an important source of deciduous litter that can offset some of those climatically mediated downstream losses. Just one other thing to say as I come towards the close of my kind of allotted 30 minutes is that, as well as the longer term work at Llyn Brianne, we have installed other kinds of experimental kit that allows us to carry out process investigations where we can accelerate other kinds of global change effects. So we have these about 20-meter long replicate stream channels funded by NERC, by the Natural Environment Research Council. We have these replicate systems in 4 of the different streams at Llyn Brianne. Already they've been used, for example, to look at the kind of degradation of eDNA signals with kind of downstream progression. But also we've used them to look at things like long-term drought effects. So here are some data from Ivan Jams, one of our PhD students, who in the experimental channels carried out a drought experiment which lasted for about an 80 or 90-day period before we increased the flow again. And what you see here is that numbers of organisms in reference channels and experimental channels under drought was markedly different. And again, this is partly reflecting the kinds of effects that climate change, if we did have more droughts, could actually bring to upland streams like those at Llyn Brianne. I mean, one of the really interesting things about data that arise over a period of 40 years from these different conditions are just how diverse the uses of those data can become. And again, this is a Stefano Lawson paper which we put in Ecology a few years ago, 2018, looking at how the nature of different kinds of organisms at Llyn Brianne, specialists versus generalists, actually appears to be changing through time. So there appears to be a decline in community trait specialization, increasing array of tolerant organisms present at Llyn Brianne. So these kind of subtle longer term changes going on against the backdrop of the other community variations that we've seen. And I myself can't even imagine how much more creative people could get with the uses of the data at Llyn Brianne, but we're always very interested in helping people who want to use our data for creative purposes to contact us and make use of the information that we've collected. So if I can summarize what I think the 40 years of my experience of Brianne have kind of illustrated, is that the work, and this is a massive team of people who've been behind this, the work through time in its early years revealed how acid rain effects affected upland streams, that influenced national and international pollution policy. The work revealed how forest management effects influence afforestation guidelines. And I know that Tom Nisbet is with us. Tom probably will have something to say at this. Tom also worked at Llyn Brianne producing some of these data. The work has showed us some of the first effects of quasi-natural climatic fluctuations on stream systems, the North Atlantic Oscillation. It's showing us some of the first climate change effects on upland streams, and we think that can influence climate adaptation strategies. And we've trained something. It's very difficult to get a proper estimate of this because a lot of MSc students and undergraduates over the years have worked at Llyn Brianne, but I think it's something like 40 postgraduate students plus. If I were to leave everyone with one last thought, I think we've only laid the foundations of understanding long-term pattern. And from my point of view, 40 years is just the beginning. We've just calibrated our understanding of the way these upland stream systems are operating. And I suspect that there is a very large amount more to do. So at which point, Corley, I will bring my presentation to an end and attempt to answer any questions that anyone might have.